Did Jephthah really offer his daughter as a sacrifice to God? That's what I want to address in this video. This is based upon a very disturbing narrative from the book of Judges, which, if you know anything about the book of Judges, is a very disturbing book in the Bible. It's filled full of all sorts of gross immorality, idolatry, and just terrible violence. And so that tone kind of sets the tone for this particular chapter as well. So if you know anything about this very difficult narrative, there's basically two schools of thought with regard to what Jephthah did. He makes a vow, which we'll get to in just a second, but he makes a vow, and this vow is that he's going to offer something up as a burnt offering, and it ends up being his daughter. Now, the two schools of thought, two schools of interpretation, which goes back centuries, is that either Jephthah kind of offered a spiritual sacrifice of his daughter, meaning that he offered her to the tabernacle for lifelong service there, where she remained a virgin. That's kind of a spiritual interpretation of this sacrifice. The other is that Jephthah actually offered up a human sacrifice, and this human sacrifice was, in fact, his daughter. So that's the basic two ways in which this narrative has been interpreted. So what I want to do is I want to work our way through this narrative and look a little bit at some of the Hebrew, and then I'm going to argue that, in fact, Jephthah did offer his daughter as a human sacrifice. And I'll explain why I believe that, and then I'll try to answer some pretty common objections to that view that people have put forward. So hopefully by the end, even if you don't agree, and of course you're free to disagree and include in the comments why you disagree and your interpretation, that's great. But at least by the end, even if you don't agree, then maybe you'll have a better understanding why people like myself come to the conclusion that, in fact, this is a terrible narrative about human sacrifice. So the story starts in Judges 11 by telling us who Jephthah is. So Jephthah was the son of a guy by the name of Gilead and then a prostitute. So after Gilead's legitimate wife had sons, these sons drove away their half-brother, Jephthah. So he had to leave home, and when he was kind of establishing his new life elsewhere, he became well known as a warrior. He gathered around himself kind of a bunch of ruffians, and they went out. The text suggests they went out on raids, and so as a result of this, he gained the reputation of being highly skilled in warfare. Now, the reason that's important is because what happened back home, the home he was driven from, is that his people, his family, well, they were faced with a threat from a foreign power called the Ammonites, and they needed someone with some military credentials, with some military experience to lead them against the Ammonites. And so who did they turn to? The very guy they drove away. They turned to Jephthah. And to kind of cut this short, they kind of make a deal. Jephthah says, okay, I'll lead you into war if you will make me the head, the leader of the people. And they agree to these conditions. So Jephthah's getting ready to go to war with the Ammonites. They try kind of negotiations first. Well, that falls apart. So they're getting ready to go to warfare. And this is where we get to the most important part of this narrative. So Jephthah's going to make a vow to the Lord. And picking up here with Judges 11 around verse 30. Jephthah vowed a vow to the Lord. And here's the gist of it. It's kind of an if-then. So if you, talking to God, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever or whatever, and the Hebrew there is ambiguous, it can be translated either way, whoever or whatever, comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall belong to the Lord, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Now, a couple things about the Hebrew that I think are important here. First of all, when it says that this whoever or whatever comes out of the house shall belong to the Lord, and I will offer it up for burnt offering. There are some who kind of present this as an either or. So they suggest that what Jephthah really means is that if it's an animal that comes out of the house, well, then I will offer it up as a burnt offering. But if it's a human that comes out of the house, then I will offer it as someone belonging to the Lord. So dedicate this person to the Lord. But I think that's a stretch with the Hebrew. The single particle vav, which is between these two statements, is probably best understood as explanatory, meaning that Jephthah is saying that whatever comes out to meet him shall belong to the Lord. That is, I will offer it up as a burnt offering. So it's not an either or, except it's that the latter part explains exactly what it means to belong to the Lord. So whatever comes out to meet me, Jephthah says, that is going to belong to the Lord in this way. It will be offered up as a whole burnt offering. And then also keep this in mind. In the ancient world, animals ordinarily did not come out to meet a returning conqueror. This would be a person who comes out to meet the returning conqueror. And so it's very suggestive in the narrative itself that even from the beginning, what Jephthah had envisioned was a person coming out to meet him. Now, it certainly was possible in this part of ancient history where animals were kept indoors, that an animal could have been coming out of the doors of his house when he returns home. But again, that would be very unusual language to use with regard to an animal coming out to meet a returning conqueror. Rather, it was going to be a person. Now, Jephthah did not plan on his daughter being that person, but as we shall see, that is what happens. And one more thing about this vow. At the very end, he says, I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Now, the Hebrew there for burnt offering or whole burnt offering is olah. And this word is commonly used throughout the Old Testament for an actual sacrifice. This is not a spiritual sacrifice. This is an animal that is killed and then placed upon the altar and offered up wholly, completely, as this whole burnt offering to the Lord. So the text in and of itself, in this use of this language, suggests that an actual sacrifice is intended, not a spiritual sacrifice, but instead a literal sacrifice. So what happens? Well, Jephthah is successful. He goes out against the Ammonites, he wins the battle, and he's coming back home. And picking up the narrative from there, we're told that when he came to his home at Mizpah, behold, that's the Hebrew way of kind of capturing your attention, behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances. And we're told that she was his only child. He had had no more sons or daughters, just her. And when he sees that it's his daughter that comes out to meet him, he tears his clothes. And here's what Jephthah says. He says, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You have become the cause of great trouble to me. For I've opened my mouth to the Lord. That is, I've made this vow to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. So right away, you ought to notice the way that Jephthah responds to this. He is distraught. Now, the whole tone of his response is more accusatory toward his daughter, which is very strange, kind of very selfish way to respond, but he's very distraught, suggestive of the fact that this is not going to imply merely that he's going to have to give up his daughter to tabernacle service for the rest of her life, but that something much more fatal is going to befall her. Now, there's more to this story, but just kind of summarize it. When the daughter hears her father respond in this way, then she basically says to him, well, if that's what you vowed, then that's what you must do. And she asks him only for one thing. She says, and this is important for those who argue for the spiritual interpretation. She says, basically, only ask one thing from you, Father. Let me go to the mountains and let me lament my virginity for 2 months. And he agrees to this, so that's what she does. She goes to the mountains for 2 months, and she weeps for her virginity, she and some friends who go with her. Now, when she comes back after the 2 months, we're told this. At the end of the 2 months, she returned to her father, and we're told that he did with her according to the vow that he had made. So exactly what he had vowed, that is what he did to her. And then at the end, we're told that she had never known a man, and it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament or to commemorate. That Hebrew could be translated either way, to lament or to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, 4 days in the year. So that's the basic story. Now, on the side of those who argue that this was not a literal sacrifice that took place, who say that no, Jephthah did not offer up his daughter as a human sacrifice, in favor of that argument is this emphasis on her virginity. That comes up, she goes to the mountains with her friends and she weeps for her virginity for 2 months. And we're told, secondly, she had never known a man. And so they say that the accent, by falling upon her virginity and not upon her upcoming human sacrifice, is an argument in favor that, in fact, this was not a literal sacrifice, but rather she remained unable to marry, remained a virgin, and therefore lived on in service to the tabernacle. And I think that is a strong aspect of those who argue in favor of that. But I would also counter with saying, yes, she was bewailing her virginity, but she was bewailing her virginity because she was not going to be able to marry. She was not going to be able to become a mother in Israel. She was never going to be able to raise a family because her father had vowed to offer her up as a whole burnt offering, as a sacrifice. So even though that can be used in favor of those who spiritualize this sacrifice, I don't think that the emphasis upon her virginity in any way negates the argument of those who say this was an actual sacrifice. Because either way, she is not going to be able to lose her virginity by marrying and having a family and becoming a mother in Israel. So I would argue that what happens is this. Jephthah makes this vow, and he fulfills it in a literal fashion. The text itself is suggestive of human sacrifice. It doesn't mean that God condoned this whatsoever. He did not. In fact, we have plenty of evidence in the scriptures where God speaks explicitly against human sacrifice, even though human sacrifice was practiced in the cultures that were around the Israelites. So the text itself, by the use of the language of offering her up as a whole burnt offering, just at face value, points in the fact that, in fact, Jephthah did engage in human sacrifice by offering his daughter as a whole burnt offering. So that's how I take that. Now, what are some objections to this view? Well, one of these I've already addressed, and that is the emphasis upon her virginity. But I don't think that in any way negates the argument that, in fact, she became a human sacrifice. Either way, whether you want to spiritualize this and say she became a servant at the tabernacle and was a virgin for the rest of her life, or she was killed and died as a virgin, either way, she doesn't lose her virginity because she's never allowed to marry and she's never allowed to become a mother. Now, some of the other objections that are raised are, for instance, well, at the beginning of this, we're told that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. That's Judges 11, verse 29. And so some will say, listen, if the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, if this was a Spirit-empowered victory that God gave to Jephthah, there's no way that a man like that, empowered by the Spirit, would engage in this terrible act of human sacrifice. Well, keep in mind that Jephthah is not the only one in the book of Judges who was empowered by the Spirit. For instance, we're told that Gideon also was someone that God clothed with his Spirit. And what did Gideon do? Well, he certainly was victorious in warfare, but he also later on led Israel into idolatry. So just because he was empowered by the Spirit to be successful in warfare did not mean that everything that Gideon did was approved by God. In fact, some things he did were certainly condemned by God. Secondly, Samson too. We're told that the Spirit rushed upon Samson. But we all know that Samson did many evil things. And so just because the Bible says that the Spirit empowered an individual, such as Jephthah, or such as Samson, or such as Gideon, did not mean that, therefore, they had kind of divine approval for everything that they did. It just means that the Spirit empowered them to engage in their vocation of rescuing Israel from these foreign powers. Secondly, some will say that, well, you need to turn to Leviticus chapter 27. That's really offering the background of this. Leviticus 27 talks about either animals or people who have been vowed to the Lord. And the common interpretation of those sections, Leviticus 27, is that this is the case where people have been vowed to the Lord for service at the tabernacle. And Leviticus 27 stipulates that if a person has been vowed for service at the tabernacle, they can also be redeemed, and redeemed by a certain amount of shekels, depending on whether they're man or woman and how old they are. And so those who argue that this was actually a spiritual sacrifice will say, well, actually, what is happening here is what is described in Leviticus chapter 27. The main weakness of that argument is that Leviticus 27 never speaks of a person who has been vowed to the Lord being offered up as a whole burnt offering. A parallel that is often put forward is Hannah in the opening chapters of 1 Samuel. Hannah saying that she is going to give over her son, who ends up being Samuel, for service to the Lord, which she does. But when she does this, she offers him for service to the Lord, gives him to the Lord, all the days of his life. It doesn't say she's going to offer him to the Lord as a whole burnt offering. Rather, this is a lifelong devotion to the Lord. So I think that objection falls apart as well. Leviticus 27 is not in the background of this because Leviticus 27 is not talking about someone being offered up as a whole burnt offering. And then finally, people will say, well, Hebrews 11 in the New Testament talks about how Jephthah acted by faith. And it certainly does. We read that Jephthah is in this list along with Gideon, Barak, and Samson, and David, and Samuel, and others who, quote, through faith conquered kingdoms and engaged in other kinds of acts as well. True, Gideon acted by faith. Through faith, he did conquer kingdoms. But again, look who else is in that list. Gideon, David as well. Well, these men certainly acted in faith in certain sorts of things, but it doesn't mean that everything they did had divine approval. David certainly did many things by faith, but he didn't by faith have adultery with Bathsheba. He didn't by faith arrange for the murder of Uriah any more than Jephthah through faith offered up his daughter as a whole burnt offering. So yes, these men listed in Hebrews 11 did some things through faith, but they also did some things through unfaith, through a blatant disregard for the word of God. So my conclusion, therefore, is that that Judges chapter 11, just at face value, when you take the words as they stand, it's describing a human sacrifice. And this human sacrifice was the daughter of Jephthah. And this, finally, this fits into the whole tenor of the book of Judges. What does Judges document over and over and over? The Canaanization of Israel. Israel slouching more and more into Canaanite sorts of ways. Idolatry, immorality, rebellion against the one true God. And so this account in Judges of Jephthah fits within that thematic center of Judges, where every man did what was right in his own eyes, including many of those whom God called, like Samson and like Jephthah and like Gideon, to engage in military conquest on behalf of his people. And so I would urge that this account of Jephthah sacrificing his daughter is one more terrible, dark, ungodly action within the book of Judges that fits with the whole dark theme of that book. Again, feel free to disagree. Feel free to agree, whatever you want to do. You can certainly give me in the comments your interpretation of this narrative. Thank you for watching, though. I appreciate it. If you like this channel, then give me a like, give me a follow, and if you wish, share this with your friends. And I pray that God's peace and light and goodness may be yours in abundance. Thanks for watching.